Here's the deal. We love Labor Day weekend because Labor Day weekend is one of those weekends where we get that extra day off of work. We get to fire up the grill tomorrow, maybe head to the lake or the river. We get to just kind of hang out, be with family a lot of times, celebrate with friends. But we just get to celebrate. It's just one day we get off of work, right? But did you know that the first Labor Day was actually on a Tuesday? Did you know that it was Tuesday, September 5th, 1882 in New York City, and it was in accordance with the plans of the Central Labor Union. I don't know why they picked Tuesday. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me, but they did. But it wasn't for 12 more years. That it took 12 more years in 1894 that 23 more states actually adopted this idea of this holiday. And on June 28th, 1894, President Grover Cleveland, this guy, signed it into office that this would be a national holiday. It would be always the first Monday in September. Some of y'all maybe never known that we had a president named Grover Cleveland, but here he is, and you got at least one thing to be thankful for is that we get tomorrow off of work because of this guy. He signed it into office. It's a national holiday. We love Labor Day around here, but the thing is, why did we need Labor Day back in 1894? Like a little over 100 years ago, I don't know how much history you've researched, but we were sending 12-year-olds into coal mines. Like our Christian nation had sweatshops like modern-day China. Like we didn't have any labor laws. There were no days off or benefit packages for blue-collar workers. I mean, it was just you worked or you didn't. And if you didn't work, you usually didn't eat, so you had to work. But then came these labor laws that were derived from the labor laws that we see in Scripture. And mainline Christian denominations actually led the charge in this. In fact, some mainline Christian denominations that we may even label as liberal today were the ones who led this. We can be good to serve our people, right? And so this is what happens. We now have Labor Day. In fact, in Egypt, there were no Sabbath days. Humans were treated like property. And we all know about the whole, who built the pyramids? The slaves did, right? We understand, and the thing is, our culture has some wounds from this same idea because of our African and European immigrants that we utilized in slavery back at the formation of our country. You see, Labor Day should always be a reminder, though, of an employer's biblical and moral responsibility to their employees. It should be a reminder of who we are and why it's important, because we're all created in God's image. We're all created in the image of God, and that's what gives us value. Nothing that anyone says or no title, none of that gives us value. It's the fact that we were created in the image of God, and because of that, we have value. And so biblical labor laws, they protected the dignity of those without power and those who didn't have a voice. And so this is why it's so important. And if anyone should understand this, then it was the Jews. You see, in the Torah, 75% of their laws, a lot of times, were about protecting the worker or the disadvantaged. And so they understood this. And so it got me thinking this past week, and I posted on my Instagram account this question. I said, what is your least favorite job? At first, when Steve asked me if I wanted to preach, I was like, sure, great. He's like, hey, will you preach on Ephesians 6, 5 through 9? It's about slavery. I said, okay, that may be my least favorite job. Right? Like he leaves town and says, here you go, Kendal, take this topic. He loves preaching hard topics, but this one just happened to come up, right? It's the beauty of preaching through a book. Now, if you've noticed, we haven't gotten to this topic yet. Don't worry, husbands and wives and parents and children. We're going to get back to you guys, but we wanted to go ahead and go through this here this weekend. But I asked this question, so I'm going to ask it to you this morning. What is your least favorite job? Think in your mind. It probably doesn't take very long for you to realize what your least favorite job was. Maybe you're currently in that job. We don't know, but maybe what it was. Here's some of the responses that I got on via Instagram. Didn't take very long, but here's a couple of them. One of them was selling senior portrait packages. They said one summer they had over 10,000 students in one summer. That's a lot of senior portrait packages and may need a career change. That sounds like that's good money. But hard work. They didn't enjoy it. They had to sell the packages, right? Another one was roofing houses. Now, I'm from Texas. In summer in Texas, you don't go anywhere near a roof. Like in the concept here in Tennessee that you can finish an attic and live up there, even like that's not a thing in Texas. We put the air conditioner up there because there's no way you're going to live in that attic. It's too hot. So roofing houses, hard work, may not be enjoyable for most, if not all. I don't know. Maybe that's your thing. I don't know. What about this one? Organizing and dusting shelves at a grocery store. As a guy who one time in college worked at Walmart, like this was not something that I did this a little bit too. It was not enjoyable. You had to dust or like just pull things forward, right? Like just make it look, because you know everybody messes with stuff and just puts stuff wherever they want. People got to pick up after that. This is what we're talking about, right? One of my friends from back in Louisiana said, weed eating pipelines for a timber company. That's what he did all day. He hung out outside in the hot and the humidity. He just weed-eated pipelines for a timber company. And then I think my favorite was a guy who said he literally just picked up after dogs. Like he worked in, I don't know if it was a shelter or a pet store, but like his job was to clean the cages and pick up after the animals. Like not a very enjoyable job, right? Like we probably wouldn't be like, oh, that's what I want to do with the rest of my life. We probably wouldn't say that. But here's the thing. See, work is a gift from God. Work was actually not the result of sin. See, work existed in the perfect world. Look at what we see in Genesis 2:15. It says, the Lord God took the man and he put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and to keep it. We were called to work. We were designed to work. It wasn't against some sinful result. This is what we were supposed to do. This is before Genesis 3, where sin entered the world, right? And before, guys, we get all up in arms like, man, I got to work because I got to take care of my wife. I got to take care of these ladies. Like, this is before woman was even created, okay? Eve has not been created yet, and the mandate has been to work. And this is what so he says this. So the thing is, we should be thankful for work. Now, some of those jobs may not be high on our desirability scale, but we should be thankful for work. And so how can we find any meaning or fulfillment in our daily vocation? How can we do this? How can we find purpose in what it is we are doing, whether it's paid or not? Well, let's turn to Ephesians chapter 6 this morning. Ephesians chapter 6, we're going to read through our passage. Just to give you a heads up where we're headed, we got to do a whole lot of context of where we're going to go, then we're going to come back to the passage, and then we're going to do some application. Okay, there's their layout for what's going to happen. But let's turn to Ephesians chapter 6, picking up in verse 5. He says, slaves, obey your earthly masters with fear and trembling, with a sincere heart as you would Christ, not by the way of eye service as people pleasers, but as servants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart, rendering service with a good will as to the Lord and not to man, knowing that whatever good anyone does, this he will receive back from the Lord, whether he is slave or is free. Masters, do the same to them and stop your threatening, knowing that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven, and that there is no partiality with him. You see, a God who loves us says that we are to submit to the authority of our employers. Now, the Bible doesn't really talk about this employee-employer relationship very much, but when it kind of talks to the idea of it, doesn't use those words. Instead, it uses these words, slaves and masters. How do we know this? You see, slavery, the situation Paul walked to, was not the slavery that we see or we saw in America. It was not the same idea. It was complex. It was massive in scope. I mean, American slavery was primarily racial, and it was lifelong. That's how it was seen in our country, right? And in Paul's day, it was not usually racial, and it usually didn't last for a life. And so already we see some differences there, right? So there were some similarities, but it was different. But for us to understand who he's speaking to, we've got to understand the historical context of slavery in the Roman days. You see, it was estimated that the Roman Empire had nearly 60 million slaves. That the town of Ephesus that Paul was writing this letter to, about a third of the people who were in that town were slaves. And the thing is, it was normal and it was an accepted part of their economic life in the Mediterranean. This is just what it was. You see, Klein Snodgrass reports this. He says, in the Greco-Roman world, slavery was so much a part of life that hardly anyone thought about it might be illegitimate. When he begins to speak to the nature of slavery, he says this. He says, they did not merely do menial work, they did nearly all the work, including oversight and management and most professions. You see, some slaves were more educated than their owners. They could own property and even slaves, and they were allowed to save to buy freedom. You see, no slave class existed, for slaves were present in all but the highest economic and social strata. Many gained freedom by the age of 30. You see, the best hope for a slave, though, at any point in time in history, was that a true Jew would actually buy them as an indentured servant. You see, they had this idea, no other religion or society provided a better path to freedom like the Torah commanded. And so Jews would follow that. God had gave them a plan to work every slave out of slavery without crushing or devastating a national economy. So he gives them this plan. And he did it in such a way for those who could still run profitable businesses, so they would allow them to work through this process to find their freedom. And so they could get their money back, they would work 7 years, and then they would be free. But so instead of buying a slave forever, they would work for them for 7 years. And they had this idea set. Maybe you've seen it in other Old Testament stories, right? But after that, you wanted to be the type, and when you set them free, that they would want to come back and work for you as an employee. Therefore, it would be wise for a master that a free man would want to come back. You'd want to treat them in such a way that they would actually desire to work for you once they didn't have to work for you anymore. They were able to work for you. And on the other side, if you were a slave, then you would want a master who would want to hire you as a free man if the opportunity came around. Because the thing is that like a lot of the slaves then were actually volunteers. Like, why would they volunteer to be a slave, right? Because this was a form of employment. You see, people struggled to eat, and they would become slaves to be provided food and clothes and shelter. I mean, the world was completely different then. I mean, there weren't jobs to apply for. You couldn't drive down the street and see now hiring signs, go inside, grab an application, fill it out, have an interview, and be working the next day. I mean, that's not how it worked then. I mean, you were either self-employed like Joseph the carpenter or Paul the tent maker, or you had a family business like the fisherman. And if that wasn't in your cards, then you most likely, probably chances were, you would be a slave. There wasn't many other options. And so the closest thing that we have to this employer-employee relationship today is this. And ironically enough, the person who would have carried this letter to the church of Ephesus was actually a slave. His name's Onesimus, right? He was the slave of Philemon. I can't ever say this. Philemon, whatever you want to say. Philemon, all right? He was a slave of him. And here's what happened. He ran away because he robbed his slave master. He runs to Rome, this very big city. He says, I can hide in this city and not be caught. But whether he knew it or not, he ends up running into Paul. See, Paul was imprisoned in Rome at this time, and he runs into him. See, some scholars suggest that Onesimus actually sought him out, that maybe he came to know Jesus while Paul was in Ephesus before. But most likely what happened is that he ran into Paul, and after he ran into Paul, he had an encounter with Jesus. Because this is what it says in Philemon chapter 1, verse 10. It says, I appeal to you for my son Onesimus, who became my son while I was in chains. While he was in chains, he became his son. And see, Paul begins to build a relationship with this slave. He begins a relationship with him and begins to learn who he is. In fact, in the next verse, he uses this play on words. He says this, he says, formerly he was useless to you, but now he has become useful both to you and to me. You see, his name, Onesimus, actually means helpful, useful, or profitable. So Paul's like crafting this letter, and he's using this in the underlying text. He's saying, hey, it was a common name from slaves then. He's saying, but hey, before he came to know Jesus, he wasn't really useful to you. He's run away from you. He robbed you. He didn't serve you any good. But now he has use. He has value. He is beneficial to not only you, but he's beneficial to me. And so on his behalf, Paul, who's still imprisoned in Rome, writes this letter to his master, and he pleads to Philemon to accept him back, but not as a slave, but as a believer and as a brother in Christ. See, Paul cared deeply for Onesimus because he was a young man who had been a great blessing to him. In fact, he had been so helpful that Paul actually longed for him to stay at his side. Look what the next verse says. It says this is, I'm sending him to you, who is my very heart back to you. I would have liked to keep him with me so that he could take your place in helping me while I am in chains for the gospel. But I did not want to do anything without your consent, so that any favor you do would not seem forced, but would be voluntary. Perhaps the reason Onesimus was separated from you for a little while was that you might have him back forever. See, Philemon and his family lived in Colossae, And the church at Colossians, where we get the letter that's written, that Paul wrote to them, actually met in his home. And he penned that letter at the same time he pens this letter to the slave master. And he mentions, like he said, that he was going to be coming home. And he actually carries this letter back to his master. And the great thing is that the heart of Paul's plea is summed up in these verses, this verse and then the following. It says, and no longer accept him no longer as a slave, but better than a slave, as a dear brother. He is very dear to me, but even dearer to you, both as a fellow man, but also as a brother in the Lord. So if you consider me a partner, there's kind of that twist. If you consider me a partner, welcome him as you would welcome me. If he has done you any wrong or owes you anything, charge it to me. Says Paul, I am writing this with my own hand, and I will pay it back, not to mention that you owe me your very self. You see, Paul makes an interesting note that he's writing this with his own hand because typically he didn't pen the letters himself. He had a scribe that would write it. He's saying, hey, I just want you to know, I know you a lot of times I use somebody to write this, but this means so much to me that I am sitting down and writing this with my very own hand because he matters that much to me. It's that big of a deal. See, forgiveness and reconciliation are spotlighted in the life of Onesimus. Like in the book of Philemon, Paul challenges the Philemon to receive him back in the same way that he would welcome himself. Welcome him like you would welcome me as a brother and a partner in the gospel. And as Paul promises to pay anything back, he says, whatever he owes, give it to me. You see, the apostle authenticates his promise by writing it with his own hand. He's saying, hey, I mean this. No one's writing this for me. I am saying these words. Don't get it messed up. Don't get it twisted. I've got it. These are what I'm saying. And so he's confirming that the apostle Paul also at the end of that, I don't know if you caught that he actually led Philemon to Christ. You owe me your very self. He's reminding him of his own salvation as well. And he's saying Paul is hoping that he will look beyond Onesimus' transgressions and reflect the broader reality of the forgiveness of Jesus. Just like Jesus forgave him of his trespasses. The one who pardons every wrong. And so all of this about slavery to say this is that Paul was not pro-slavery. And so sometimes I feel like when we open these passages and we look at them, we look at the text, we're like, hey, he doesn't really straight up say slavery's bad. But again, contextually, he's talking about a different form of slavery, and he's very clear that he is not for slavery. But what he is for is the wise and biblical process in which we can affect change without civil wars. You see, when he begins to write here in Ephesians, he's planting seeds of destruction of slavery. He's planting these seeds. He's beginning with the Christian community. He's saying, I'm going to start here. It's subtle, but it's powerful. It's subtle but powerful. He planted the seeds of the destruction of slavery. You see, John Stott says this, that the gospel immediately began, even in the first century, to undermine the institution. It lit the fuse, which at long last led to the explosion, which destroyed it. See, here's the thing. If America would have followed the biblical plan and processes for freedom, we could have gotten out of the chattel slave system that we inherited from the British. It wouldn't have taken us hundreds of years. We could have got out of it way sooner. And we could have actually empowered the disadvantaged to have successful lives. But instead, we just told blacks in the South that they were free. And if we're honest, we didn't do a good job at that. That's why we celebrate Juneteenth. And we definitely did little to nothing to prepare them for freedom. And this is where the church needs to step in, not take Scripture out of context and hold it to what its value is. And so we need to follow the theme of equality throughout all Scripture. That there's no partiality. You see, the command of this passage is clear. It's live all of life for Christ. Not live of all of Sunday morning for Christ and live your Saturday night how you want. Not live all of Wednesday night for Christ and live Monday morning how you want. Not live how we want to in this space and not in our workplace. This is how it's talking about. We need to live all of our life for Christ. And so Paul's writing this to two different audiences. Two different people in the same place, but two very different roles. He's writing these to slaves and to masters. So now let's jump back in the context. Remember, we said we're going to do a little background. Now let's go back into the text and let's see what truths we can pull out of the text. Here's what the first part of verse 5 says. It says, slaves, obey your earthly masters with fear and trembling. I think the truth we can pull out of this verse is that we need to work respectfully. He's telling them to work respectfully. Paul says this idea to obey in fear and trembling. It carries the same idea that we see in Ephesians 5:21. It says, submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ. This theme runs through all throughout the end of chapter 5, which we'll get back to. Steve will get back to that when he comes back. And then we've talked about this in the same portion, that the submitting to one another out of the reverence of Christ. You see, slaves were to work seriously and reverently because they were working unto Christ. And the way that they worked would be a testimony to those around them. See, he's writing this letter to the believers. That doesn't mean all slaves are believers. But he's saying, hey, those who are, work in such a way that you can live a testimony to them. Work respectfully in a way that your testimony will share who it is you follow. But he continues in the rest of verse 5 and verse 6, says, with a sincere heart, as you would Christ. Not by the way of eye service as people pleasers, but as servants of Christ, doing the will from the heart. We need to work wholeheartedly. He's telling us, hey, you need to work wholeheartedly. Notice the emphasis here of a sincere heart. And he says, doing the will of God from the heart. We've got to work wholeheartedly here. Paul's urging the slaves or the bondservants not to be hypocrites. Not to be hypocrites, like only working when the master or the boss is present. I don't know if you've ever worked one of those jobs where you're like, hey, I ain't working that hard with my boss in here. Like, I get paid by the hour, okay? Like, the longer it takes me, the more I get paid. Like, sometimes that's how we see the world. I've done that before in my life. Like, hey, we're going to do that on company time, right? Like, whatever it may be. But he's saying not by the way of eye service as for people pleasers. Now, this idea of people pleasers is hard for me to understand because I don't understand people pleasers, okay? I think that we discovered that's a 9 on the Enneagram. Are there any 9s in the room? Do we have any 9s? Yeah, I don't get you guys because sometimes I do the opposite and upset people, okay? So but he's saying this, hey, don't work just for other people. He's saying work as you're working for the Lord. Work wholeheartedly. You see, this was a common temptation in the days, in this context, for the servant to be lazy or to lie instead of working faithfully. But we would never lie about work or be lazy about it, right? We're going to continue. Verse 7, he says, rendering service with a good will as to the Lord and not to man. He's saying, hey guys, we need to work willingly. We need to work willingly, serve with a good attitude, not a begrudging spirit. A begrudging spirit's not like fruit of the spirit. we need to get rid of that. We should be serving with a heart and a soul that is all for the Lord, doing it because it is his will. And that's what he's telling these slaves to say, hey, I get it. You're here, you're indentured servants, you're kind of stuck here, but I need you to work willingly. I need you to work with a cheerful and a glad service. Could you imagine how countercultural that would have been? Being cheerful. It's kind of countercultural here. What do we say all the time? We got a case of the Mondays. Like, what if you showed up on Monday cheerful and glad to be at work? You're like, I don't know, it'd be hard. Right? But that's what we're commanded to. Look what he says in verse 8. He keeps going. He says, knowing that whatever good anyone does, this he will receive back from the Lord, whether he is a slave or is free. And this is the why he gives these other things. He wants you to work expectantly. He's telling these slaves, work expectantly. He's reminding them that the ultimate reward is coming. Remember, you got to try to put yourself in the context of when the letter was written. There may be not a lot of hope. There's not a lot of wealth here in the people he's addressing, right? He's saying, hey, the ultimate reward is coming. So work expectantly. No act goes unnoticed. You see, believers will appear before the judgment seat and will be rewarded based on our present faithfulness. Look what Matthew writes in his gospel. He says, "For the Son of Man is going to come with his angels in the glory of his Father, and then he will repay each person according to what he has done." And then Paul writes to the church of Rome, he says, "He will render to each one according to his work. To those who by patience and well-doing seek for glory and honor and immortality, he will give eternal life. But for those who are self-seeking and do not obey the truth, but obey unrighteousness, there will be a wrath and a fury. There will be a tribulation and distress for every human being who does evil, the Jew first and also the Greek. But the glory and honor and peace for everyone who does good, the Jew first and also the Greeks. For God shows no partiality." There's no favorites. He shows no partiality. Paul even writes to the church at Corinth, and he says, "For we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, so that each one may receive what is due for what he has done in the body, whether good or evil." Now think how that perspective could change the way that we could work. The writer of Proverbs even says this. He says, "A man's spirit can endure sickness, but who can survive a broken spirit?" I don't know if you've ever been in that place in your life where your spirit was broken. But man, it takes everything in you to get up out of bed when your spirit is broken. And he's encouraging these slaves who feel like they're in a winless situation. They feel like they're in this winless situation and their spirit is just broken. When your spirit's broken, life can become unbearable. You don't want to talk to anybody. You don't want to get any, getting help seems, it seems like it can't happen. You feel like you're never going to crawl out of this because your spirit is broken. But here's the thing, what lifts your spirit? Christ. The hope of future glory. That is what can lift your spirit. And Paul is saying you need to work expectantly because there is going to come a day where you're going to be in glory with the Father. You see, and Paul does this really, I love the way Paul writes. He begins to link these two, verse 8 and verse 9 together. And in fact, he does at the end of verse 8 when he says that whether he is slave or is free. And he begins to shift who he's addressing because this principles that he's talking about apply to the slave or to the free person. And everything he said is just kind of a human duty before God that we should work expectantly, we should work willingly, we shouldn't have a begrudging spirit, all these different things. And he says all of this, and he says, hey, it applies to the slave, it applies to the free. Oh, and by the way, I have a few other things to say to you who have these slaves. And then he addresses the masters. He gives them one verse, but it's packed full of multiple things. He says, masters, do the same to them and stop your threatening, knowing that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven, and that there is no partiality with him. See, notice there's like 4 different things he says in this one. He gave a whole bunch of verses to the slaves. Now he's saying, master, you got one verse, but hey, read slow. Pay attention. Because these instructions right here would have gone against everything in Roman culture. Remember, 60 million slaves, a third of their city. Masters would have been like, wait, you want me to do what? You want me to treat them the same? You want me to stop threatening them? You want me to realize that we have the same master in heaven? Like we're equals? Like this would have gone against culture. And this is what he's telling them. He said, hey, we got to practice modality. We've got to practice this idea. We've got to do the same with them. Even masters, treat your slaves as you want to be treated. Treat your slaves as you want to be treated. Does that sound familiar? Like Jesus spoke to that, like love your neighbor as yourself. Apparently they've been missing it all these years, right? We still miss it today. This isn't a crazy concept to treat your slaves as you want to be treated. Like we teach our kids this concept all day, but how often do we live it out? Man, there's nothing more we want to treat. I have 2 little girls, a 6 and a 3-year-old, and they woke up at 5:30 this morning, just yelling. I don't know what they were doing in there. We were trying to sleep. We're like, we'll clean it up later. But it's a constant battle. And I've talked to a whole bunch of y'all who just have girls, and there's like a secret bond, like if you just have girls, and like I'm extremely outnumbered in my house. Like there's my wife, my 2 daughters, and then our dog's a girl. So 4-on-1. So like, that's the thing, there's not a whole lot of testosterone in my home, and so like there's tears, and there's a lot of estrogen, and like they don't know how to treat each other sometimes. Because we've got to learn how to treat each other like we want to be treated. And Paul's reminding these masters, hey, you need to treat your slaves with integrity, you need to treat them with respect, you need to treat them with humility, you need to treat them with gentleness. Like we hear some of those things, we're like, duh. But this would have been something new in their world. You need to treat them as you would Christ. If Christ was working for you, how would you treat him? See, if the masters wanted respect and service, then they should also give it. But he doesn't stop there. He tells them that we've got to avoid hostility. He says, hey, stop your threatening. I don't know if there's ever been a master ever that didn't threaten their slave. Like, what else do you have against them? Like, you got to feed them, right? Like, this is the only thing they usually had. And he's saying, hey, I know this isn't normal, but you need to stop your threatening. You don't need to be hostile towards them. Don't use aggression toward your slave. Try something new. It would have been extremely rare, but Christian masters were to be different. As Christians, we're called to look different than our culture. He's calling them to something higher. He tells them later to be accountable. He's saying in this passage, be accountable, knowing that your master and their master is in heaven. And the masters were to live in fear of Christ. Not a trembling fear, but like a reverent fear. They were to live in fear with Christ. The Proverbs says this, it speaks to the accountability. It says, the rich and the poor have this in common. The Lord made them both. The poor and the oppressor have this in common. The Lord gives life to the eyes of both. The Lord is the judge of all the earth, of every person. Not some people, not church people, not people who won't show up to church, not people who disagree with us politically. Every person. Every person. And this is a sobering truth that can change the way we live our life when we actually come to the realization that there's no one better than us, that we were all on the same playing field. And here's the why. We've got to remember impartiality. We've got to remember impartiality. There's no partiality with him. There's no favorites. The thing was, partiality was actually written into the Roman law. It was written into their law, but Paul's delivering this idea that on the last day that it won't matter. If we're honest with ourselves, there's partiality written into our culture. But the reminder is that at the last day, it won't matter. You see, Roman law may have discriminated, but heavenly justice does not. And that's where we've got to land. See, Paul's teaching is shortening this gap between servant and master. It's bringing them a lot closer, putting them on the level playing field where they had never been on before. It was a brand new idea. And that way of life was radical. And so you may be sitting there thinking like, I get it, but I'm not a slave. I don't have a slave. I'm definitely not pro-slavery. Like, in fact, you're just making me uncomfortable talking about all the slavery we've had. Like, I get it. It should make us uncomfortable. But here's the thing. This passage is life-changing when we begin to apply it to our life, because no work is merely work. Like, no work is merely work. You're not just doing a job. It's a way to serve Christ. And if these principles applied to someone in probably an awful work environment that worked for a slave master, then I think that they could probably apply to you who have better working conditions than them. Can we agree on that? Like, I don't think, no matter how much you dislike your job or all the jobs I listed before, they're not as bad as the jobs in the context of our text this morning. And so what can we take away from this passage for us to kind of apply it to our lives and how we can change the way we view things, change the way we live? And here's the first thing addressing the employees, that we need to work through Christ, like Christ, and for Christ. If you're an employee, you need to work through Christ, like Christ, and for Christ. What do I mean by that? How do we work through Christ? Paul is addressing the church, right? This letter is written to Christians. So if you are a follower of Jesus, he's talking to you. Like, hello, you remember the movie Back to the Future? Like, I'm like, Fly, you there? Hey, like, anybody home? He's like, somebody are like, I've never seen that movie. Go watch Back to the Future, the first one. It's the best one. Anyways, this applies to you. These are believers who have been spiritually raised from the dead. They've been saved by grace through the atoning death of Jesus. And because of that, the Holy Spirit resides inside of them. And if you're a follower of Jesus, you've been spiritually raised from the dead. You've been saved by grace by the atoning death of Jesus, and the Spirit resides inside of you too. And so they and we don't have to live our lives, so we don't have to love our spouses or raise our kids or work our jobs alone. We don't have to do those things alone because the living Christ abides in us. And so work through him. Like we said in Ephesians 5:21, submitting to one another out of the reverence of Christ. That's the verse that leads to this passage. That's the idea that Paul's talking through. He's saying, hey, remember this, as you're doing that, now we're going to talk about this. And but this verse built on this verse. Where it says, and don't get drunk with wine, which leads to reckless living, but be filled by the Spirit. So you got to be filled by the Spirit before we're really able to submit to one another out of the reverence of Christ. You've got to do those two things before you're really able to do what we're talking about today. You see how this all stacks on top of each other, right? This is what we want to see, that we've got to be dependent on the Spirit's power. We've got to be dependent on it. You can't do it alone. If you want to gauge if you're dependent on the Spirit's power as you walk into your workplace, let me ask you this question. Do you pray before you go to work? Do you pray before you go to work? I don't just mean like your prayer list or in your quiet time. I mean, do you pray that as you're going to walk into your place of work, that the Spirit will fill you even more so that you can be used as a missionary in your workplace? Are you relying on the Spirit of the Spirit's power for you to be able to share the gospel with your coworker? Maybe like, I can't share the gospel at my workplace. If you rely on the Spirit's power, he'll help you to weave those into conversations. He'll help you build relationships with people at your workplace where you can go to lunch where you can share the gospel. Are you relying on his power to not just necessarily invite people to church, but to actually share the gospel with them? I don't know if you know this or not, but evangelism is inviting people to church and sharing the gospel. Are we asking God, are we praying that we can live sent in our workplace or on our campus? Say, God, give me the words to say. Give me the eyes to see the opportunities, the boldness to step into those opportunities, and the words to speak in those opportunities. Are we relying on the Spirit? That's how we work through Christ. But he doesn't just stop there. He says you need to work like Christ. And the cool thing is he gives us this, Jesus is like the model work ethic. Like we get this great example. I mean, he was the ultimate servant. Jesus was the ultimate servant. He humbled himself. He died for sinners. He took the form of a slave. He left heaven. Hello, we're all trying to get to heaven. He left heaven to seek and to save the lost. He said, I'm going to come down there to your earth so I can save you. And he came not to be served, but to serve as a ransom for many. And this is the example we see. I mean, the thing is, on earth, Jesus was a carpenter. Like, Jesus was a carpenter, and he worked hard in a dumpy little town called Nazareth. Like, there wasn't much there. Like, he almost gets insulted later on in his ministry. Oh, that's the guy from Nazareth. Like, that's literally what it is, this dumpy little town in Nazareth. And this is the sinless Son of God who's working a job until he turns 30. Have you ever thought about that before? Like the fact that the Gospels, we see all these great stories of Jesus' ministry, but that was 3 years of his life, and he just worked a job until he was 30. He just made tables. I don't know, whatever carpenters do all day. I don't know, but he just did that. He just worked with his dad, and they just did stuff. And I bet there was plenty of times he's like, man, it's hot. I wish we could start this ministry thing, God. Like, I'm tired of just being in the background. But he did it because he was working under the Father. He knew he was working expectantly. I mean, would Jesus have disrespected somebody at work? No. Would he have slacked off when no one's watching? No. Would he have billed someone for extra time? No. Like, would he have been a begrudging servant and just be like, oh, here we go again, doing the same thing, playing in this table? I don't know. Like, no, I don't think so. Like, would he have minimized his job? The answer is no, because he knew that there was something greater. He was working towards something else. And if you're a follower of Jesus, then we need to be great in your service. You need to be great in your service. Be the best at whatever it is that you do, even when no one is watching. No matter who's watching, be the best as you can. But I can tell you this, is that people are paying attention. People are paying attention, and because there's no better place to share the gospel, to make the gospel look good to non-believers than the workplace. See, when I was 4 years old, I lived in Duncanville, Texas. Anybody know where Duncanville, Texas is? Still same two, we all both services, awesome. Same people, it was like three in last service, awesome. I didn't expect you to. It's a little suburb of Dallas. Grew up in Texas. I have an older brother and an older sister. My older brother is way older than me, 9 years, and my sister's 6 years older than me, so I remind them, especially now, much since I'm 35, that they're well into their 40s. Sorry. 40's not old if you're 40 in the room, but to them it is when I tell them. Hey, but here's the thing. We had this hill at the end of our street. There's a couple houses down. It was a good-sized hill. When I remember it as a 4-year-old, it was like Mount Everest, but I don't think it was that big. But it was big, and I would watch them ride their bikes down this hill while I just kind of puttered around on our driveway because I had the training wheels on my bike. I was learning how to ride a bike, had these training wheels, had the really expensive training wheels. They were made out of plastic. Thanks, Mom, Dad. But let me just back that up a little bit. This was the era where, and probably most of y'all grew up in, we didn't wear helmets. Like, how many of y'all grew up in, you wore a helmet growing up when you were little, riding a bike? And no one in the room because they're all down in the kids ministry, right? But now we make our kids wear all the helmets, right? Like all the things. Anyway, this was before helmets. So I guess I don't know if they were a thing or not. But in our house, they weren't really a thing. It probably should have been a thing as we'll continue the story. But hey, I would see my brother and sister ride down this hill, and so one day I was like, hey, I'm gonna be big. I'm gonna walk my bike up this hill. And I walked it down the street. I walked it up this hill. I got on my bike. I got ready. And I don't know if you know much about bicycles, but when bicycles don't have handbrakes like little kids' bikes, the brake is you just push back on the pedals, right? Which is great until you start to go so fast that your little legs can't keep up with the pedals, which is exactly what happened as I started to go down this hill. I made it about a third of the way down this hill, and I began to tump over. Bike, me, everything just fell. Cool thing was I made it about another third of the way down the hill. And then I came to a stop. I'm crying. I'm 4, don't judge me. I'm crying. I'm bleeding from my knees, my elbows, somewhere on my head. I probably should have been wearing a helmet. But I picked up my bike because I wasn't about to leave my pride and joy behind. I picked my bike up. Training wheels have shattered because, remember, we had the expensive ones, the plastic ones. They shattered. I walked my bike down to my house, and I walk into my kitchen just crying and bleeding and all the things to a frantic mom when she sees me trying to figure out what just happened. Now that I'm a parent, I look back on this story and the idea of it, and I'm like, first of all, I got some questions, Mom. What were you doing so important not watching your 4-year-old as he just roaming the neighborhood with his bike down the street? And also, why didn't I have a helmet on? I'm just kidding. But I share that story for this reason. My brother and sister never said, hey, Kendal, you should ride your bike down this hill. I watched them every day take their bikes down this hill. I looked up to them. I wanted to be like them. I wanted what they had. I saw how much joy that they received by riding down this hill on their bikes, flying past our house, laughing, cutting up, all the different things. And I wanted what they had. And so I decided I'm going to try be like them. They had influence over me, whether they realized it or not, just by the way of their actions. That's why it's so important for us to work like Christ in our workplace. Because people are paying attention whether you realize it or not. You have influence amongst your coworkers, amongst your friends, amongst your family that you don't even realize. And if they're even remotely interested in Jesus or curious about what joy it is that you have at the workplace, like it's Monday, why are you so happy at 8 a.m. on a Monday? We're here again. What's going on? They're going to be curious, and that's when you can lean into those conversations about who Jesus is and how he saved your life. So we need to work like Christ, but we also need to work for Christ. We need to work for Christ. You should do the best you can as if you were doing it for Jesus. Charles Spurgeon says this. He says, did anyone thus dream of supervising Raphael and Michelangelo? Just a heads up, that's not the Ninja Turtles, okay? Just want to make that clear in case anybody was confused, all right? He says, to keep them to their work. No, the master artist requires no eyes to urge him on. Popes and emperors came to visit the great painters in their studios, but did they paint better because of these grandees? Gazed upon them? Certainly not. Perhaps they did all the worse in the excitement of the worry of the visit. They had regard to something better than the eyes of the pompous people. You should work for Christ now, but realize that you will receive a reward later. You see, our works don't save us, but we're saved for good works. And you should look forward to the day when we hear the King say, "Well done, good and faithful servant." See, we often in this life focus on the nature of our job. But the Bible puts the focus on being faithful to our job. We put the focus on the job, but Scripture tells us we need to put the focus on faithfulness to our job. And so as he addresses these employees in the first part of this passage, he's saying, hey, these are the things that are important, but by the way, there's something else I need to address. And he goes back to the masters, and this is what we're going to take away today. He says, employers, if you're an employer, if you have people who work for you, you need to lead through Christ, like Christ, and for Christ. So very similar. But we almost raised the bar slightly because that's just the challenge of leadership, right? That's just the challenge. Like, you take on responsibility and you make sacrifices that most will never see. And because of that, you need the Spirit's power. I mean, Paul felt that pressure when he was leading churches. He even describes it in his weakness, that the grace of Jesus is sufficient. Look what he says. There it is. Look what he says. He said, to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is perfected in weakness. Therefore, I will most gladly boast in all the more about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may reside in me. We've got to lead through Christ. But we also need to lead like Christ. Christ's not just the model servant. We saw that right before. We need to work like him. He's not just the model servant. He's the ultimate master. He's the ultimate master. I mean, Jesus modeled servant leadership. He displayed the attitudes that we should follow. He came to serve. I mean, this is the guy who took up the towel. He washed the feet. He cared for the vulnerable. He hung out with the people that were the outcast from society. He didn't seek to satisfy, or he didn't seek earthly praise. He didn't seek some Instagram following. He was a shepherd and not a dictator. He was a servant leader. And that's the example that we need to follow as leaders and in our workplaces, that we need to lead like Christ, but we also, why? Because we need to lead for Christ. We need to lead for him. Paul says that masters will give an account. And as a leader, you may have more opportunities to bend the truth. As a leader, you may have more opportunities to make unethical decisions. Because a lot of time in leadership, there's less accountability and you have more control over your own time. But he's saying lead like Christ, because you need to remember this, is that your audience is Christ. Your audience is Christ. Your employees are watching. They're paying attention. The thing is, Christ was an impartial master, and we need to seek and honor him with holy leadership. See, oftentimes we want to go to people and tell them that Jesus died for their sins and that God raised him from the dead, and they respond to you like, man, that's great, but did you know you don't show up on time? You don't do what you're going to say you're going to do, so why would I believe what you have to say? As followers of Jesus, we steward a story. And that story is the greatest story of all time, the story of the gospel. Sometimes I get so frustrated because I see people having conversation and I'm like, why would someone believe in the Jesus that you call Lord if you can't keep your word or treat them with respect? I have conversations with college students who walk into a campus and maybe they want nothing to do with the church because they have how the church has treated them in the past. Sometimes from a workplace, sometimes from a family, sometimes from a local church. So I think that question, like, why would somebody believe in the Jesus that you claim if you can't even show him in your actions? And the thing is, the text crushes this idea of our accepted cultural hierarchy of value that we see in our society. And although there's different roles, like the roles don't define someone. The hierarchy doesn't exist for the Christian. And we have the same Lord and we await the same judgment. It's a level playing field. And as Christians, we should relate differently to the people in our culture. We should relate differently than the culture sees them. So I ask, don't give preferential treatment to a certain class or ethnic group. Care for the rich and the powerful, but also for the poor and the powerless. Like the thing is, your political affiliations or the way you think the country should be ran doesn't make you superior to anyone else. Because there's no partiality in the kingdom of God. And so we may disagree on things, but we're still equals and co-heirs of Christ. That means be careful with your body language, your attention, how you communicate to others, how you're perceived on social media. Don't give anyone the impression that you're superior. Don't give anyone the impression that they're not worth your time. Don't dehumanize individuals by thinking less of them. But on the flip side, don't idolize any human by thinking so highly of them. We need to treat people like Jesus died for them. What would it look like in our world if we began to treat people that we encounter like Jesus died for them? Because he did. Jesus says this. He says, "For what does it benefit a man to gain the whole world yet lose his life?" Here's the thing, if you know Christ, you are rich. And because of that, you can say with Paul, as having nothing yet possessing everything. I may have nothing, but I possess everything because I know Jesus. And so my question for you this morning as we close is this: do you belong to Christ? If your answer is yes, then you have everything. You have everything. And what you do in this life matters. But what matters most to you? Is it the economy? Is it the president? Is it your team? Is it your grades? The thing is, we should all long to say with Paul, "For me, living is Christ and dying is gain." That should be our banner. For me, living is Christ and dying is gain. And the thing is, this morning, if you don't have Christ, then that's my invitation to you. That's my invitation to you. Will you make him your ultimate master? Will you make him your ultimate master? The master that became the ultimate servant to die for sinners like you and me. You see, Jesus came to do the thing that we can't do for ourselves. He freed us from the slavery of sin, and he's bringing us into a loving relationship with the Heavenly Father. He came to set you free. And if you'll just accept his grace, then you're no longer a slave to sin, but you're a son and a daughter of a king. And so I don't know what God's calling you to this morning. I don't know how he's asking you to respond. I don't know, hey, maybe it's how you are in your workplace. Maybe it is to receive him for the first time this morning. If that's you, find one of us after this service. There's nothing better we could do than to talk to you about how to follow Jesus. But I don't know what he's calling you to this morning, but I ask that you not miss and that you'll respond to what he has for you.